This is Dan Schneider. On this Dan Schneider video interview, the subject is Once Upon a Time in the West, Sergio Leone's final Western. Well, actually not final, but his final great Western. And I will be talking with Gordon Briggs and Eric San Juan about why it is a great film. The subject is Sergio Leone's Once Upon a Time in the West, and I have Gordon Briggs and Eric San Juan to talk about it. Gordon is up on the top of the screen. He's done a handful or more of these shows with me. Welcome back, Gordon. As I usually like to do, if you could just take a couple of minutes, talk about who you are, what you do, and your opening volleys about Once Upon a Time in the West.
Thanks for having me, Dan. Hi, my name is Gordon Briggs. I'm a instructor at the University of Rio Grande. I teach art there, but my first experience with Once Upon a Time in the West came when I saw it on Turner Classic Movies in, I want to say the early 2000s, maybe the late 90s. I was in my early 20s when I saw it. It was one of the first films that made an impression on me as far as its soundtrack goes. It made an impression on me as far as the use of music to tell the story. We can get into specific scenes, but I remember very vividly this opening scene, or second to opening scene, where a family is massacred. And just as a child runs out the house, you see this score, electric guitar, I want to say, strike and hit the screen, and you see men coming out of the shadows and killing this whole family. It really made an impression on me. So that's one of my first memories of Once Upon a Time in the West.
Eric, same for you. If you give a little background about yourself and your opening thoughts.
Yeah, my name is Eric San Juan. I have a background in journalism. I've written or co-written some books on film, including two about Alfred Hitchcock, one about Martin Scorsese's films, another about Akira Kurosawa's films. I remember coming across this movie when I still thought that I didn't like Westerns, or when I still thought that, well, Westerns, that's an archaic genre of film, and I'm not into that. And I recall encountering this along with one other, which I'm sure we'll end up touching on at some point in this video, specifically Unforgiven. And realizing with those two films, which are very different, and yet they both comment on the genre in ways that are important. I remember when I saw this, and this film for me kind of summed up the mythology of what a Western is, or should be, or can be, and it made me kind of understand what the allure was of the genre. In a lot of ways, much like Gordon, the music drew me in, and so many other things that I think we're going to get into as we have this discussion. I kind of feel like, in a lot of ways, for me, Once Upon a Time in the West is the Western movie. And for that reason, I think it's incredibly important for anyone who's into film to talk about whether or not you love Westerns. This is an amazingly important picture for film, because to me, it defines the genre in an abstract, mythological kind of way, which we'll get into.
Before you joined us, Eric, I was talking with Gordon about the output, and it's hard to realize that Leone had such a small output of films of his own. Really, you can throw out an early Sword and Sandal epic, The Colossus of Rhodes, and Duck You Sucker. And then you're really just down to 5 films: the $3 films and the 2 Once Upons.
Yeah.
And the dollars, follow a progression from the least one, which was the first one. What was it? What was the first dollar film?
Fistful of Dollars.
Fistful of Dollars. Yeah. Then a few dollars more, and then Good, Bad, and Ugly. Each of them getting better. And then sort of, I think, reaching the apotheosis here. And you can make an argument. I was, again, talking with Gordon. You can make an argument about which film is better, Once Upon a Time in the West or in America. I would go with the West.
Argument, by the way. Yeah. Impossible argument.
Well, I would go with West simply because it's a bit leaner, even versus the best version of America. But let's talk about the progression that got us from a sword and sandal epic in just a decade or so to this great work. Eric, what are your thoughts about the progression of Leone in his career from a second shot setup man with Fellini and a couple of others to where he got in this film?
I think what's so impressive about this is that Leone, he clearly had an incredible sense for action, staging action, cutting action very early on. I mean, that's what's so powerful about those first two films in the so-called Man with No Name trilogy is his sense for action. He brought this very visceral sense of things happening that we hadn't really seen in American filmmaking before. But that is kind of what impresses me most, is that he was so good at that idea of, shot reaction, in these ways that impacted you that films of that era perhaps didn't. Where by the time he got to Good and the Bad and the Ugly to some extent, and then especially here, he all of a sudden out of nowhere went from fifth gear to second. And he just slowed it down in a very deliberate, very knowing way that I find really impressive, because he did it in a way with purpose. So when you watch Once Upon a Time in the West, for a lot of viewers, especially a lot of viewers who are new to it, rather whether they're new to this movie or new to the genre, it might feel slow, but it's slow with a purpose. Every scene that's quote unquote slow is with a purpose, and to me that's something that's always kind of struck me, because he started off not that way at all. Fistful of Dollars and For a Few Dollars More, these are very dynamic, visceral films. So for him to have the instinct to understand how to do that very deliberate pacing that he perfected in the two Once Upon films is kind of amazing to me.
Gordon, what's your take on the progression of Leone from the late 50s to this film?
This is strange because last month I saw the Dollars trilogy over again, and it's really, really good. All three of those movies are good, I think. But it almost seems like Once Upon a Time in the West is a culmination of all those skills that he refined in the first three movies. I think the best thing to talk about this movie sometimes is to talk about it in contrast to some of those American movies we were getting from John Ford. I think if you look at For a Few Dollars More, which is the second one, which is a very good movie, and so is Good, the Bad, and the Ugly is a masterpiece, I think. There's a moral, I don't want to say moral ambiguity. They're not about good people. Sometimes in American Westerns, you would get movies like Gary Cooper and John Wayne, and they would be basically morally upstanding people. And in these Leone movies, you got the thief, the crook, the killer, the bandit. They're the main character. And we also have to take into account that Sergio Leone is someone who is clearly being inspired by the films of Akira Kurosawa.
Oh boy, yes.
Not only inspired by the films of Akira Kurosawa, I think he brings this epic quality to his westerns. Sometimes these shots go on. Look at the opening scene of Once Upon a Time in the West. That scene goes on for 10 minutes almost, and there's
with no words spoken.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, no, that's it. That's all I wanted to say. Like, with 10 minutes with no words spoken.
No words spoken. You hear like water drops and raindrops and things like that. So I think he is similar to John Ford, that he is relying a lot on the landscape to do the storytelling. But there's a grittiness and a lived-in quality to Sergio Leone's films. And also, I don't know who did the casting, but this guy uses close-ups like no one else. He will give you these vast, sweeping shots of the landscape. Then all of a sudden, he'll get in like really tight on someone's face, and you'll see like the cracks in their face and stuff like that. So I see just an incredible amount of discipline when I see Once Upon a Time in the West. It's almost a movie. I read that there were critics who knocked Good, the Bad, and the Ugly when it came out for being too long and too violent. I could not imagine The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly being 2 hours long. I mean, I don't think it would work as a movie, and I couldn't imagine this film being 2 hours long. So just the scale and the scope gets larger and larger and larger, and the amount of patience that he is asking from his audience is not what a lot of directors would do. But it's all good because those scenes, they always pay off. They always pay off.
Yes.
That scene with the go ahead.
Gordon, when you talk about this film being a culmination of what he did in the three prior westerns, I mean, I couldn't agree with you more, of course, because it very much is. And I think one of the things that really struck me the last time when I just watched it most recently for this show is you are 40 to 50 minutes, you're about 50 minutes into the movie, and you've, at that point, depending on how you measure, you've only had 3 to 4 scenes. You've had maybe about 4 scenes in the whole movie at that point. You've had the opening at the railroad. You've had the massacre at the McBains. You've had Mrs. McBain arriving, and then you've had the confrontation at the bar with Harmonica and Cheyenne. Four scenes in about 50 minutes.
Yeah.
Like, I don't know what modern audience would tolerate that, and yet it is so right for what this picture is doing.
It's very deliberately paced because they really don't give away the game about the water and the train station until about 2 hours into the movie.
Yep.
So it's only about 2 hours into the movie, I'm guessing here, that we even know what the stakes and what we're all fighting for. So the first 2 hours is just kind of set up for this confrontation that's supposed to happen in the climax of the movie. But there's a great deal amount of patience to this film, and I think that might be where the title of the film comes in, Once Upon a Time, that it's both realistic and mythic. It's kind of a fairy tale.
Yes. Yes. This movie is a Western fairy tale in the best way. The best way.
Well, let me ask. I've always thought it's more of a deconstruction of the Western mythos. If I look at Western fairy tales, to me the archetype is Shane. I mean, Shane is almost this mythic god that comes down from the mountain and is the hero of a little boy and goes through the adventures and is upright and whatnot. Here we get an almost total mixing of that up, especially starting with the fact that you have Henry Fonda at that point. For the previous 35 years, Henry Fonda was Hollywood's golden boy, the good guy. He's the guy in the Steinbeck films. He's fighting for the little man and whatnot. And the first we see of him, basically, he does one of the most callous acts of child murder up to that point in cinema history. So I think what Leone does is he takes these archetypes set up wonderfully in that first 10 minutes or so, and he subverts them all. In many different ways, whether it's Harmonica, being the guy who can outgun everyone, but it feels fresher, even though we've seen that 1,000 times with the good guy doing that. So what is your take, Gordon, about this also being a deconstruction of Western mythos rather than just an apotheosis?
I think it can be many of those things. I think that this is not only a deconstruction of the Western. The way I saw it is, like Unforgiven, it is something about the death of the frontier, about the death of the Western. I think that this whole idea of the train coming isn't just a plot point. The train represents the future. With the train comes civilization, and with civilization, the frontier is going to become civilized, and the cowboy will no longer be needed. So I think this is the late 1960s he's operating in. The classic Hollywood Western's gone, We're getting the beginnings of, our wild bunches and our revisionist Western period. So I think this is a movie that is about uh, death, because the deconstruction of the Western, but the death of cowboys, the death of the frontier, or the inevitable death of the frontier. And remember Charles Bronson's character, Harmonica, when they ask him what his name is, he just replied with dead people. I think that there's this idea that I wasn't around the 1960s, but I think that audiences go into these movies now knowing what the tropes are, and he's kind of turning them all on their head by saying, yeah, no one's going to ride bravely into the sunset. Everything here is going to be, everyone's going to die. The only one who survives, I think, this whole ordeal, I mean, Harmonica does, kind of, but is the woman.
Mm.
She's the only one who kind of comes out of this whole thing. She owns the property, right? So she owns the property, and she's passing along the water. She's going to literally mother civilization from this place. So I think it is a deconstruction of the Western, but I think it's also a movie about kind of putting these Western tropes to bed by killing them all.
Yeah, she's sort of the Eve of the West there. Eric, do you have a take on Leone as deconstructing the genre?
I do. I'm actually going to go a little bit against the grain and say that I don't think that this film is a deconstruction of the genre. I do think that perhaps he intended it to some extent, but I kind of feel as if this film is more of his attempt to perfect the genre as opposed to break it down into its component parts and figure out what makes it work. To me, as I mentioned earlier, like if there was a Mount Rushmore of westerns, this would be like 1 and 2 on there, and we can maybe talk later about what the other two would be. But this, on the coin of westerns, it would be this, and the flip side would be Unforgiven, which I think is the deconstruction of the genre. For me, I kind of feel like this is Leone's attempt to perfect what the genre is, or how he sees it, and I mean that in the way that the all the archetypes are there and they're perfectly realized, and there's not really any kind of flaws in those archetypes. Like you recognize, this is one of those films where you recognize how it's all going to play out even before you see it, and that's okay, because the way it plays out is kind of part of the importance. Gordon points out very aptly that at the end, nobody really wins except for Mrs. McBain. She effectively becomes, as Dan said, the Eve of the West. She is the winner, because all these badass dudes just kind of, through atrophy or their own, they wear themselves out. They kill themselves off. It kills that part of the Western out. But I think that is inherent, to me at least. I feel like that's inherent in the Western, is the idea that, hey cowboy, I'm the last guy. I'm going to come in. I'm going to take care of business. I'm going to move on, and then life is going to get better. And so that's what this movie does. Whereas Unforgiven is all about the suffering that is inherent in that story. So for me, like I feel like this is less a deconstruction. It's more of Leone saying, in the perfect Western, here's how this all plays out. So that's where I go against the grain a little bit. Not a little, So.
Well, let's talk about the film and its critique of corporations and capitalism, because in most westerns that you'd have gotten decades before, Frank is the big bad, but here he's been reduced to what Martin Sheen was called by Brando in Apocalypse Now. He's just an errand boy. He's an errand boy for the railroad baron, and he's not even someone like Jesse James, who's fighting for the lost cause of the Confederacy. He's not someone like Billy the Kid, who's this romantic kind of young kid from real life, battling for whatever causes he may have thought of in his various wars with the cattle barons. Frank, for all of his persona and from what we get, why harmonicas after him, is really just an empty shell in a lot of ways. He'd be sort of the modern corporate empty suit. He doesn't really have any of the power. Gordon, what is your take on that dynamic and what it says about the rise of American capitalism or the robber barons?
I thought it was so interesting that they set up Frank to be the villain, but Frank has someone to answer to, but this guy who lives on a train, almost like a James Bond villain, he has all the modern luxuries there. But this guy, did they establish, was it TB that he had, or polio, or his boss?
It was not polio. I should remember this because it was a major plot point in a Kurosawa film. The lung disease.
TB?
Something?
TB?
TB, yes, yeah, tuberculosis.
Okay.
Yes.
So that the guy is literally corrupted and his body is corrupted. But there's this interesting character moment with Frank where he tries to be the capitalist. He tries to be the guy who marries the woman, and it almost reminds me of when the gangster tries to go legit. It reminds me of this guy who really is an outlaw. He was a killer. He's a cowboy. He tries to be a businessman, but I don't think he really belongs in that world. He belongs on, the frontier. So I think what they're saying is that this violence, this, how do I put it? Usually in some of these John Ford movies, like, I don't know, Red River or Stagecoach, not John Wayne movies like Red River or Stagecoach, the cowboy is killing off the indigenous population to make way for manifest destiny, to make way for white civilization. Here, you're seeing a lot of people getting killed off to make room for the railroad. So I think that the movie is different than a lot of the westerns that are coming before, where it shows that manifest destiny wasn't just a genocide of the indigenous people. It was killing off everybody, everybody. So I think where the critique of capitalism comes in is that it's saying that commerce, money, is a different kind of gunslinging. That it's a different kind of robbery. It's a different kind of outlaw. Ultimately, I think the irony of this is that thanks to Cheyenne and Harmonica, that deal that the guy had for the land, it all works out in the end for her, doesn't it? So in a way, it's saying this whole thing is a success, not for the family who got killed, but it's saying that thanks to these violent outlaws, that the woman actually made out, and that the whole thing was worth it. Because remember, there's this interesting line where Jason Robards was like, "Oh, he found water here, and he was gonna sell it for his weight in gold." And Harmonica's like, "No, you don't sell his of a lifetime. He actually wanted to build something."
Yes.
So he's actually contrasting maybe two different types of capitalism. One of them is this underdog entrepreneurship, this guy who wants to build something, and the other one is this greedy, destructive railroad company that wants to kill the people who actually bought the land.
And Gordon, you mentioned something just a bit earlier, and I can't remember your exact phrasing, but you're kind of talking about the power in that time and place and era, and there's a scene where Frank, Henry Fonda's character, is in the rail car, and he draws a gun real quick because he thinks he thinks his boss is maybe going to pull a weapon.
Yeah.
And his boss pulls out this stack of money, and he basically says, like, there's something more powerful than your gun, and it's this. It's money. It's
Yeah.
money. He's making this point that, like, yeah, you guys dealing in your violence and intimidation and all that, that's fine. You can do that all you want. But this is the real weapon. And I can wipe all of you out with this weapon. And it's kind of a powerful statement that you didn't see a lot in Westerns prior to this, because to go back to Dan's original question, it's a commentary on not just the capitalism of the era, but capitalism in general. This idea that this guy who could barely get around himself, he's confined to a rail car, right? Remember, there's the great moment where the it lowers down from the ceiling.
And he has the pole that he's walking on. Yeah.
Yes, he's got the contraption that he needs to walk around the car, just to show you how this guy is very powerful and influential, but he's a physically meek man. He can't do anything physically, and yet despite this, he is the most powerful man, at least at the start of the movie.
Yeah.
And so this defeats all the gunplay and all the rest of the movie, because this guy is kind of calling shots, because dollar bill, y'all. That's what it comes down to,
Yeah. And we have to talk about his last scene. His last scene where he's just kind of rolling around the mud.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, let's talk about the two putative good guys, Harmonica and Cheyenne. Cheyenne is, I guess, half Mexican, or maybe 3/4 Mexican, and we don't really know anything initially about Harmonica. Harmonica seems more like the classic stoic good guy. He might be even somewhat at home in the Shane-like kind of Western universe, but Cheyenne is something different. He himself is a crook. He and his gang are sort of lesser versions of what Frank and his gang were, and they, like Frank, are being sort of pushed to the side of the story that's being told. But Cheyenne also seems to have one thing that Frank lacks, which is at least the semblance or the ability to have some kind of moral construct. What is your take on those two reputed good guys, Eric?
With Cheyenne specifically, I think kind of what's fascinating about him, and with Leone's the way he unfolds the character, is that he begins as your stereotypical big bad, or the henchman to the big bad in a Western. And you realize pretty quickly, I say pretty quickly, but now that I think about it, it's over an hour into the movie, because of course that is how this film is paced. But you realize that Cheyenne is a much more complex character than you thought. You understand through dialogue that his backstory is basically that he is this area's hitman, not hitman. Hitman's not the right word, but he's the tough guy. He's the guy when Cheyenne's dudes show up, it's bad news. But at around the halfway point, a little more than an hour away into the movie, when Cheyenne realizes that he's just being used, and he's being used perhaps against a woman who doesn't deserve it, which is an interesting thing that I don't think that gets unpeeled enough. Cheyenne's kind of call to morality happens when he has this conversation with Mrs. McBain, the Claudia Cardinal character, in her home after she just realized that the family's been slaughtered and so on. And he kind of comes to this off-camera realization that this is wrong, and why are we messing with this woman? This is just, this is wrong. So he all of a sudden, out of nowhere, decides to start to go against the people who've hired him, which I think is interesting. And that all plays into, I think, what makes Cheyenne such an interesting villain, anti-hero. He's not an anti-hero. He's a villain, but he's the good kind of villain. I'm sorry, Gordon, I see you have a thought. Go ahead.
Oh, I was gonna say, Cheyenne is just a godsend to audiences, I think, because he is a criminal who's also a good guy.
Yes.
He's a good criminal, which
Yes.
means he gets to commit all the crimes that you and the audience want to commit. He gets to kill people. He gets to break the law. But at the end of the day, he still basically does the right thing. He has a moral compass. He's not a million miles away from some of these outlaw gangster figures we see, or like a Han Solo maybe. This person is out for themselves, but everyone else seems to be sexualizing the woman, including Frank, including Charles Bronson.
Yes.
There are moments where Cheyenne she makes him coffee, and he drinks the coffee, and he's like, "You make this coffee just like my mom used to make." And there's this
incredible line that he said.
There's this moment where he looks at her as a motherly figure, but there's this idea that by showing him being kind and decent to her, we know in the audience that we can root for this guy because she is safe around him. Plus, just as a fan of Westerns, one of my favorite kills has to be the boot kill, where he puts his boot down in the train car, and the henchman's like, I got him. I'm going to shoot him in his foot. And bang comes the gun barrel out of the foot of the boot, and you're like, oh.
That's a great one.
There's these moments where he gets to be the criminal, but he doesn't get to be the bad guy. I think of him as what I would call an outlaw, which is one of these figures you see in Westerns where, like a Billy the Kid maybe, or Jesse James, or Clint Eastwood would play this guy sometimes. He's not on the side of the law, because sometimes the law is corrupt, but he does have a moral compass. He's not going to kill children. He's not going to kill women. And he's not going to kill anyone who doesn't have it coming. So that's what I think is the interesting thing about Cheyenne. And you actually do kind of feel sorry for Cheyenne, because you realize at the end that he's wounded, and that he's mortally wounded. Mm-hmm. And it's like he wasn't giving away the fact that he was wounded. And I'm just like, oh, Cheyenne actually gave his life. He actually sacrificed himself for this train station, for this battle, for this cause. And he protected this woman who's going to be around. So in the end, he does become a hero, doesn't he? He becomes one of the heroes.
So he has one of these great arcs, the sense of like he recognizes he's a bad guy at first, but then he recognizes the greater good, and even though he's still, look, he's still a jackass, he's still a villain, he does bad things. When he recognizes the greater good, he steps back and he's like, okay, this is more important than me, which is one of the things that makes him a great character. I want to call back to what you said a moment ago, where you said, these other characters sexualize Claudia Cardinal's character, which completely, Frank obvious, and even Harmonica, who is supposedly the hero. And
there's that one scene where he pushes her down and like rips her clothes off.
Yeah.
You're like, is a rape about to happen? But it doesn't really happen. But yeah.
I've seen this film so many times, and to this day, I'm still not quite sure what Leone was going for there. I get that, okay, he wants to intimidate her and all the rest, but it's such a, maybe it's the context of knowing the kind of scenes that Leone would direct in Once Upon a Time in America, which has two very difficult to watch scenes, especially one in particular, which is...
Yes.
Yeah. Very hard to watch.
I think Harmonica is trying to get her to do what he wants, which is go out to the well and draw out fire, I think. How he goes about that is to walk into her house, toss her down on some whatever, and rip her clothes off, and you're implying rape. I almost get the sense, do you guys get the sense that Bronson is serving the Eastwood He's almost like Clint Eastwood in the other ones. And Clint Eastwood would do this in his movies. I mean, he would almost intimidate everyone else sexually and say, "Look how potent I am. Look how big my gun is."
Well, I was just going to ask that, Gordon, about where does harmonica, is harmonica an extension of the man with no name?
He gives these names when they're all dead men. And remember, if you ever seen what's the Clint Eastwood movie where High Plains Drifter, where he plays a dead person who comes back to life and avenges someone there. So he does seem to be the Western trope of the man with no name. But the only caveat I would say is at the end of Once Upon a Time in the West, we do find out who harmonica is, at least in relation to Frank.
Yeah.
So he's not.
Yes.
He does have a definitive person of who he is, and he does tell you why he wants to kill Frank. But he is this kind of person, the man with no name. I don't know if you guys heard this story. I heard that Leone wanted the three guys from Good, the Bad, and the Ugly to be the people who met him at the train station.
Yeah, I've heard that, yeah.
Yeah, and that he would kill them off at the start of the movie, and it would establish, okay, harmonica's a badass.
Yeah.
He just killed off Eli Wallach, Lee Van Cleef, and Clint Eastwood.
Well,
can you imagine for a second that would happen?
And with the actual casting, and I think the fate worked in this movie's favor. But initially, with the harmonica character, Leone wanted Eastwood to play harmonica.
That would have been perfect, yeah.
He and Eastwood actually turned down the role. I can't remember the reasons, but he turned down the role. I'm glad he did.
Yeah.
Because I think having Bronson in the lead as opposed to Eastwood divorced the film from the trilogy.
Yeah.
So that we can take this film on its own terms. If it was Eastwood, we would have had to contend with the idea of like with that character compared to the trilogy character, and I think that would have not served the film in the way that having Bronson in it did.
And Dan, to your question about Cheyenne, I just think that Cheyenne also adds a little bit of humor to a very, very serious movie. And he is kind of serving the same function that Eli Wallach played in The Good, the Bad.
Well, not to the same degree, though. He's a couple of notches down.
But Eli Wallach, but he's adding a little bit of levity because Frank and Cheyenne are these silent, stoic, cold-blooded characters, and that could bring a movie down a lot. And Robards is just having a bit more fun, so that he might just serve a function as being comic relief.
Well, with the harmonica character, when we find out the revelation that who he is, there's the great scene where I guess it's maybe 8 or 10 minutes where him and Frank are just circling each other, getting closer, and then you see the flashback. I don't think that Eastwood, even in his best roles years later, is as good an actor as Bronson at his best in terms of conveying things with his eyes. And I'll tell you, I think Bronson in the 60s and 70s is one of the most underrated actors, because if you look at it, and putting aside the Bang Bang one in the subway, but there's a great film where he's a boxing champion going along.
Hard Times.
Yeah, right. And
Walter Hill.
Right, and there's something about his eyes that conveys a pain and a stoicism that you can believe. When I'm watching that film, I'm feeling that the Bronson character, harmonica, is really feeling this. With Eastwood, and even when it's sort of meta and he's doing the stoic thing just to be stoic, it's all as a put on. So I think the Bronson being cast in that role worked out better in the long run, because I think he's simply a better actor than Eastwood.
Dan, I couldn't agree with you more, and this is one of the reasons why I like talking about films with you, because you're seeing this very kind of subtle yet powerful and effective stuff that comes across, I think, in films. I love Eastwood in westerns. I don't want to knock the guy. I mean, because even beyond the Man with No Name trilogy, Unforgiven is the big obvious one, but he also did stuff like Pale Rider, which is basically Shane but on steroids.
Pale Rider, High Plains Drifter, Bronco Billy. Yeah,
Oh
the
yeah,
guy. Yeah, the guy knows what
yeah,
he's
yeah,
doing.
yeah. I mean, the guy brings it. Don't and when it comes to westerns, especially, he brings it. So
Mhm.
not knocking him. However, Dan, what you're saying is completely accurate and completely correct. That Bronson, especially in this era, before he got typecast as the guy who
Yeah.
looked at the camera, he he was getting across a lot through his eyes and through the pain that he was, that intangible thing that good actors can do. He got across a lot in this film, as well as other films in this era, um, that works for this picture. Because I think you need to, in order for this movie to work, you need to buy the idea that harmonica is there for a reason. Because you have 2 hours until you're given his backstory, until you realize why he even cares about Frank. Otherwise, he's just some guy who shows up and does some gunslinging. He plays the harmonica every now and then, and he does some gunslinging. So you need to recognize that there's something that's driving him. And I think that Bronson always gets that across in his eyes in a way that you can't you can't really put a finger on how or why he does it, but it's there.
Yeah,
Does
and
that
it,
does that
it
make sense?
it's odd because I think in real life he was Latvian or Estonian. He was from the Baltics or something, and yet he's playing these Indians and Mexican characters in the westerns that he's in, and yet he's fairly convincing. He's got, for some reason, he's sort of like Yul Brynner. In terms of looks wise, I mean, Yul Brynner could not have done harmonica.
Yes.
That would have been hilarious. But he has that kind of ethnic look where he can fit into all sorts of roles. But let's
He was
pull.
the Isaac shit. I'm losing his last name. Um, yeah, sorry, I lost his name. Isaac something or other of his day. He was just in uh, Moon Knight from Marvel, and so on.
Oh, Oscar Isaacs.
Oscar Isaacs, that's right. Yes, from Ex Machina and so on.
Yeah, yeah, you get to play every person of color out there.
Yes, yeah. He's even said, because I think he's a Guatemalan born,
Huh.
but he's played like Middle Eastern characters, Mediterranean characters, Latino characters, white characters, like, because he can get away with it. It helps because he's a really effing good actor.
Yeah.
So,
All right,
he
let's
could do whatever.
So we've laid out basically the main motivations and the main characters. I want to talk a couple of things. Gordon had mentioned about the close-ups on faces, and nowhere is that more apparent than in the shootouts. Good, the Bad, and the Ugly had the three-way shootout, and we find out how Eastwood had left Tuco exposed without him knowing it. But this shootout with Frank is probably the ultimate, if not the ultimate, Wild Western movie shootout. Because we get that 2 or 3 minute flashback. Although I will have to say, I think they could have gone a little bit less with the shoe polish in Fonda's hair. It adds a weight to it at the end when, without a word, he just pulls off the harmonica and sticks it in Frank's mouth, and then Frank just expires. Let's talk about that final gun battle right there, and then the end of the movie. Because where do you rank that as an all-time gunfight? Either one.
Okay.
Go ahead, Gordon.
Or, yeah.
I have a lot to say about this thing. First of all-time gunfight. I think that the final showdown in Once Upon a Time in the West not only is probably the best gunfight, I think it probably has the second best movie close-up ever. Close-up on someone's face. I would put Passion of Joan of Arc as number one. It's an old black and white movie.
Oh my man! Oh my God!
Yeah,
Oh,
yeah. and maybe the opening shot of Clockwork Orange, but
Wow.
yeah.
I'm sorry, I just did not expect that to come up. I'm just, yeah.
Yeah, best I have the best close-ups in my head all like that.
Well,
Anyway,
my wife will like that. She's a Dryer fan, so.
Yeah.
yeah, that movie is one long close-up, so you
Yeah.
have to get to. Anyway, I remember being struck by the music in the movie, the editing of Once Upon a Time in the West, and the close-ups and the story. All of those come together in that last scene. Not only do the two circle around each other, so it's kind of a callback to Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, but we get a close-up on the person's eyes, Bronson's eyes, Harmonica's eyes, and he looks into Fonda's eyes, and then we flash back to the past.
Yes.
So we're not only jumping several decades, I'm sure, into the past, we're also slingshotted back to the past by the gunshot. I mean, sling back to the future by the gunshot. So
after like an hour, 2 hours of movie.
Yeah,
More than 2 hours of movie.
And we have this thing where they circle each other, close up on the eyes, and then we see Frank coming in from out of the mist, and the thing that's been just a musical cue for Harmonica and his name now takes on extraordinary dramatic and narrative significance because he also puts it in his brother's mouth and says, "Keep your loving brother happy." And you realize that it's when he's playing this harmonica, he's probably also flashing back to his brother's death and his feelings of guilt about his brother's death. I think it's just a tremendously well edited and well shot scene. Because the scene ends with a shot, with a gunshot, you see Henry Fonda flip around and look at you. And Henry Fonda has this look in his face, almost like he's shocked that he's been shot. He's surprised.
Yes.
I actually kind of feel pity for Fonda at that point, even though he's a cold-blooded killer. You're like, oh, Harmonica was faster, but he had it coming. So I think it's a tremendously well done scene where we're editing something, giving us the close-up, and jumping back in time and delivering us some crucial information to the audience. That's about 2 hours and a half into the movie, where finally all your questions are being answered as to who this person is. I've seen many, many close-ups. I have not seen one that's that intricate that actually jumps back in time based on someone's eyesight. So I think it all culminates in that movie. And I think it's a terrific use of sound, too. How they keep playing, not with the harmonica, but with the whole idea of we're going to hear that sound again. Oh, that sound of gunshots. We're going to hear that again.
Yes.
Tremendous scene, I think.
Gordon, when you talk about sound, I think that's one of the most important things about this movie. And I think that by modern standards, some of the sound design might seem clumsy. Mm-hmm. The ADR is a little, spotty at times.
Italian spaghetti western,
And harmonica's playing, right? It's supposed to be in the scene, but sometimes it's not in the scene. There's all these things that modern audiences might have some trouble with, maybe. But I like to give audiences more credit than that. And I feel like if you come into this film with an open mind, you're going to get it really quick. And when you get it, the sound in this picture is kind of incredible because the sound and the soundtrack is always leading you towards what Leone is trying to make you understand. With harmonica's theme in particular is one of the big ones. Mm-hmm. The understanding that he's playing, and when he's playing for a purpose. It's not just to draw the audience's attention, though that's part of it. He's drawing, the bad guy's attention. He's doing this, he's doing that. Like it's this tapestry that just kind of works, and it's this series of layers that is kind of remarkable. The fact that the more you unpeel it, the more it still works. And I know you have a question, Dan. Though I do know that Gordon said something that shook something in me just a moment or so ago. And he talking about sound and specifically harmonica's theme, harmonica sound, and it reminded me of, and in the way that harmonica sound reverberates all the way to the end of the picture. You hear it in the beginning, and then in the end of the picture, you hear it again, but you understand what it means because you see the context of his past. And I feel like Leone took that idea in Once Upon a Time in America, and he wanted to extrapolate upon it. Was Once Upon a Time in America opens up in this almost infuriating ring, this telephone ring. As I'm sure you guys know, it just goes on. It's
20
it almost
times.
gets to
It
the
rings 20 times.
Oh yeah, it gets to the point of like it's almost annoying, and yet that sound is incredibly important to the story that unfolds with all the characters. It means something. And in this film, the same way, the harmonica playing that tune means something. There's a meaning there that reverberates throughout the entire film. I feel like in America, Leone kind of fulfilled that idea, but it's here the seed is here, you know.
I want to
Also, Once Upon a Time in America, they have the pan flute, the do 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 do,
Yes.
which is like the harmonica, and it keeps coming up and actually triggers the person's memories of the past. So it is similar here. It's good. Yeah. Good point.
I wanted to just make a comment about the use of the music in Greek plays. There was the chorus and antichorus, where the sounds and the singing of the people on stage, the chorus, would introduce or then comment upon it. And I think in the Dallas trilogy, all of Morricone's music is sort of bruiting something. The event is coming. The good guy is coming. The bad guy is coming. Here, I think it's almost all antichorus, especially when you find out about harmonica and his brother and Frank's killing him, is that the music always seems to be commenting on something that's just passed. We see a defeated looking and dying Cheyenne. We hear his theme. We get the memory of harmonica, and then the harmonica theme, as you said, sort of closes out. Even the final sweeping shot upward, where we go up from Jill and we see the train coming and the guys laying the track. That's sort of saying this is over. Something else is coming. But it seems to me that the music here always works in anti-chorus, or 95% of the time in this film, as commenting on what we've seen, whereas before it was all chorus. Do either of you have a comment on that, Morricone's approach?
I do, and I think I would like to think that this is a reflection of where Leone was at this time, because I feel like for the films leading into this, Leone was still finding his voice. He was still, and not in a bad way, because I don't think this is a terrible thing, but he was still lifting from Kurosawa, and even score-wise, soundtrack-wise, that's kind of how Kurosawa's films played.
Well, it should be said that Kurosawa openly admitted he stole from John Ford, and he stole from the first Dallas film is supposedly a ripoff of Dash Hammett, a story.
It's all very circular. Yeah, because Kurosawa was hugely influenced by Ford, and then so when Kurosawa started to do samurai films after in his post-war period, he was all about like, all right, I want to do my version of what John Ford was doing, and then it got into Italy, and Leone started doing his version, and so on and so forth. But I guess my point is that in those initial Kurosawa films, when Kurosawa was basically doing like, here's a Western but made into a samurai, the score was punctuating what was happening. And that was also sort of the case with Morricone's initial scores for Leone's first couple of films. Here, though, it gets into a little more what you were talking about, Dan, where the score more begins to comment on what either is happening or, more importantly, has just happened. Because I think at this point, Leone wasn't riffing on, hey, I can do John Ford westerns, but like more hyperkinetic and more violent and so on. He was kind of like, what is the western distilled? That's why I think that's why I think Once Upon a Time in the West is the western, because it's like, what is the western distilled? And Morricone's score kind of plays into that, because it's not as much punctuating what's happening, it's commenting on the themes and ideas and tropes that we're so very used to, in a way to enhance them, in a way to bring them to our attention. We recognize, oh yeah, here's the anti-hero coming in, or here's the sorrow of the woman, but it never comes at the time when you would expect or want it to come, which I think is an interesting choice. I don't know if any of that makes sense.
Yeah. Gordon, any comments on what Eric said or what I said?
I'm going over the chorus in my head, and what you guys were saying about commenting on just what has happened. I guess I didn't realize it was doing that till now. When I was looking at the movie, I was emphasizing. What was strange to me was how much that Morricone was emphasizing silences. That there was a lot of silence in this movie, and that's to me what gave the score punch. Was
Yes.
that you would get long, extended periods of silence. I remember there's this tavern scene which comes about 40 minutes into the movie, where they're walking into the tavern and Cheyenne comes walking in and says, "Have you heard of some guy playing a harmonica?" And he just takes a lantern and swings it up to Cheyenne's face, and all of a sudden the musical cue happens. I'm like, that musical cue has power, because we were quiet for 5 minutes.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking that even the opening of the movie is quiet for a long period of time. So I think what gives the musical score impact is the fact that it is these huge operatic voices and numbers coming in after these long periods of silence. I think one of the things that made that Good, the Bad, and the Ugly three-way shootout so good is just how it just builds, and then one instrument comes in, then another instrument comes in. We have the guitar, then it's the trumpet, and it's like. So I think that there is this very precise use of silence.
Yes.
There too. Also, I don't know if you guys noticed this. Maybe I'm listening too closely. The way that gunshots happen in this movie, they don't sound like regular gunshots to me. I don't know. It's like the gun will go off and then he'll cut to a train whistle. Or it's somehow like the gunshot means more than just a regular gunshot. I don't know, because I'm thinking about there are gunshots when the capitalist guy wants to kill Frank. But again, it's long use of silence, punctuated by either gunshots or music. So one of the things that impressed me was the filmmaker's use of silence.
Gordon, I have to confess that I noticed the same thing that you have noticed, and I've never, in all these years, been able to decide if it is a result of a deliberate choice by the filmmakers, the sound engineers, the Leone and the rest, or if it just that's what sound was, and in the day, and so it just sounds that way. And I say that, of course, having seen many films of the era, these sound different, but these sound different for a reason, of course, because as we know, watching. I don't know if you can categorize this as a spaghetti western, because to me, spaghetti western is filmed in Italy and the rest. And this to me is Leone breaking out of being spaghetti westerns. This is a Hollywood picture. However, he's still making it under the same constraints and so on. So I guess my point is, are a lot of those sound choices, and I've never been able to decide, are a lot of those sound choices just a result of what the technology was of the era, or are they actual choices? I don't know. That just
Yeah.
because I go back and forth on them. Sometimes I'm like, oh, okay, yeah, I don't know.
So let's talk about the reception and influence of the film, and then we'll talk a little bit about what Eric wanted to talk about with Unforgiven. Um, as far as I can tell, it did well, as most of Leone's later films did well financially. But then there's what was it, a dozen years almost between this and the next major film, throwing out Duck You Sucker. Um, where do where was Leone? Was he just trying to get Once Upon a Time in America made? And I guess Duck You Sucker was not a good experience. Uh, uh, but where was he in the 1970s after this movie? Was he just sort of adrift looking for a project? Eric, do you know?
Um, I kind of feel like Leone was I mean, and this almost makes me think like, wait, maybe should this be the next thing that I write? I don't know. Um, but he was in a similar spot that Kurosawa was in, where he had done this series of incredible pictures, sometimes incredible in a way that people didn't recognize at the time, and then just couldn't get money anymore. I do think Leone, though, he had a propensity to have an appetite bigger than he could actually. What is the saying? Your something is too big for your stomach or something like that.
Eyes are
My
too
mother
big
used
for
to say it to me.
eyes are too big for your stomach.
Yes, your eyes are too big for your stomach. I think Leone might have um, uh, succumbed to that to some extent. This picture, of course, did fine, but it wasn't an explosive success. So it wasn't the sort of thing that was gonna have him like getting people signing up, um, studios giving him a bunch of money. But his aspirations were bigger after this. He wanted to do, he had this idea in mind of doing this big, expansive, multi-picture thing of, basically about the history of the United States, or the specific era of the United States, that he ultimately wasn't able to do, but he kind of sort of did between this and Once Upon a Time in America. Um, I don't know. I don't think this picture got him where he wanted to be and needed to be. It wasn't the mainstream success that he needed to be, and that doesn't surprise me, because as good as he is, um, his I would say his pictures and his style are tough to get through. I don't actually think that, but I think they've been distilled by Quentin Tarantino specifically into these kind of bite-sized ideas that, like, if you told some film audiences now, hey, if you like Tarantino, you'll like this, like, then maybe they get what they're watching. If that makes sense, Gordon.
I don't know what Sergio Leone was doing between this movie and Once Upon a Time in the West. I have no clue to what he was trying to do. I do know this, that some people who read Moby Dick when it first came out said, that was an okay sea book. I think that there are a lot of people that might have watched Once Upon a Time in the West and The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly and be like, that was a pretty good Western. And the totality and its impact and its influence and its quality sometimes does not hit you on its initial release. And a lot of these filmmakers, how many times have we read about these very, very talented filmmakers who just can't get money, or whose films don't make, I don't know why this guy is in my head. I don't know how you guys feel about Peter Weir. I love Peter Weir's movies. Peter Weir made some fantastic movies like Master and Commander and Picnic at Hanging Rock. The guy gave up Hollywood because even though he makes good movies, his movies don't financially set the world on fire, and he
Yeah.
can't get money for what he wants to do. And I also think about the time period in which Once Upon a Time in the West came out. Not to go into the depths of film history here, but this is a time that American film students call the American New Wave, or the rise of the film school brats. And you have these directors like Coppola and Scorsese and William Friedkin and Woody Allen, Polanski. All these people are coming out, and they're making their own westerns. Which you got Bush and Sundance coming out. You got The Wild Bunch coming out. Dan, you asked me what was the best Western shootout. Wild Bunch Climax is number 2. So you have these other Westerns that are coming out who are maybe kind of eating up the audience that Leone might have done. But I remember that he did read this book called The Hoods. And based on The Hoods, he was inspired to create Once Upon a Time in America. So I think it's just what's happening is this large change in Hollywood, but also the quality of the film as being a masterpiece doesn't become fully realized until much later. I was looking at Oscar nominations or something like that. Did this film get Best Picture or something like that? Did it get any nominations? I don't think that it did. I don't think that.
Let me see. I got it. I got it in front of me. I would be surprised if it did, and also disappointed though. No. I'm seeing nothing. Nothing.
Well,
nope, nothing. Which is incredibly.
Whoa!
I wouldn't say surprising, but incredibly disappointing, because to me, this is like when I talk about my finest films of all time. You know, I don't like the idea of like best, because you can't do that. But like favorite and finest and all that. This is on the list, like in the top 10 or whatever. Top 10, top 5, top 15, whatever. This is in that running. It's a remarkable piece of work.
So the people who are in charge of canonization at this part are not singling out Once Upon a Time in the West. I think it's a movie that people have come to appreciate. It's not like, I don't know, The Godfather, where everyone says it's a masterpiece and hear a bunch of awards. This is something that people have come to appreciate, because part of what I think is necessary to appreciate Once Upon a Time in the West is a knowledge of other Westerns. And I think the more Westerns you've seen, the more you'll appreciate Once Upon a Time in the West. I think that not a lot of audiences have seen a whole bunch of Westerns, or how you distinguish this one from the other ones. I think the more gangster films you've seen, the more you might appreciate a Miller's Crossing or Once Upon a Time in the West, Once Upon a Time in America. I think the more film literate you are, the more you might appreciate what he's doing here as far as refining the West.
Gordon, you make a great point. I'm sorry to interrupt you. When you mention the more gangster films you see, the more you will appreciate Once Upon a Time in America. That's one thing that I often tell people in the rare cases that I recommend it to people. And I say rare not because I don't think it's a brilliant picture. I think it's perhaps Leone's masterwork. This might be his masterwork, but it's close.
Both are masterpieces.
Yeah, they're both incredible. But I only recommend it to people when I know they have this is gonna sound terrible, but like the requisite background to kind of get what he's going for, because it's such a slow, methodical, very purposeful piece that otherwise, like unless you kind of I kind of pose it to people like, yeah, all right, if you love The Godfather Part 2, if you want that, but more of like
It has to be long. It has to be. It has to be long. And I
Yes.
always hesitate to recommend Once Upon a Time in America to people because the movie is 3 hours plus long.
Oh,
So you have to section out. I wouldn't cut a minute of it. I want more of that movie.
no,
But it's
it's
3 hours plus long for your recommending people, and you know how people's attention is so divided now and fractured now. It's like sit down for a Sunday afternoon and watch this 3.5 hour violent movie about rapists and outlaws and
oh god,
and at the end it all might have been an opium dream and you're
yeah,
and
yeah,
I gave a rave review for it on my Facebook, and people looked up and were like, "This is how long?" I'm like, "Yeah, it's a long, long movie." So I
it,
think, like a lot of these films, it's difficult for it to travel, especially in the era of streaming. It's difficult for a film like this to travel because it is a big, long sit to
I
sit.
agree. Though I
Yeah.
will say this, and I think the three of us will all agree on this for modern film fans who are fans of Tarantino. If you like Quentin Tarantino's films, you kind of have to see Leone's films, especially this and The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. You kind of have to because fully 50%. All right, I'll be nice. Like 30 to 50% of Tarantino's language comes from these movies, and I don't say that as an insult.
Oh.
I say that in a nice way. But you have to see these movies because you understand where his language comes from.
Eric, how did you feel about the Kill Bill movies?
Honestly, you want my honest opinion?
Of course.
I really like Tarantino a lot. I did not like the Kill Bill movies at all because I felt like they were, to me, reference, reference, reference. It was Family Guy, but in movie form. Like, here's a film reference, here's a film reference, here's a film reference. I like most of his other stuff a lot. The Kill Bill movies, I actually didn't for that reason.
So Django you're cool with, and Hateful Eight cool with?
I'm okay with Django. What was the other one you mentioned?
Hateful Eight.
I actually really loved Hateful Eight. Yeah,
Okay, cool.
yeah,
I'm
I
trying
love
to.
Hateful Eight. Django was really good, but like 45 minutes too long.
Who else references Leone nowadays?
Well, but Tarantino, basically, his films are really set for teenage and college age boys. I mean, Leone was working for adults, and I think that, to me, that's the difference. And I'm not a big fan of modern Marvel type movies or whatnot. But I don't think, I had mentioned to Gordon before we started, if you want a great gangster film, watch The Killing of a Chinese Bookie by John Cassavetes. A Greek makes a great film, and Ben Gazzara is better than what's his name, Pacino in The Godfather, and I think Pacino did a great performance, but it doesn't compare to the realism of Gazzara. But that's another conversation. Eric, you had wanted to talk about Unforgiven, and it as being sort of a counterpoint to this film.
Well, yeah, all right. So for me, all westerns come to 2 points that are basically 1 point, but flip sides. I don't know if there's I don't know if there's a physics thing where like one molecule or one atom can be the two things, but like all westerns come to this 1 point that are two sides of the same coin, and they are these two films for me at least, and it's Once Upon a Time in the West and Unforgiven. And Unforgiven is the film that we're let's start with Once Upon a Time in the West. Once Upon a Time in the West is, for me, it's the fairy tale version of what the perfect Western is. And when I say fairy tale, it doesn't mean like everything is perfect and good and all that, because clearly it isn't in the movie. We know that. But it's like it is Westerns distilled. That's what this film is to me. This is Westerns distilled. Unforgiven is Westerns broken down into its component parts and reminding audiences that, hey, do you remember that, that like, these people who are getting shot are like living and dying and suffering? Or do you remember that the people who are doing all the shooting, even though you sort of knew it in these other pictures, do you remember that these anti-heroes are actually reprehensible assholes with terrible backgrounds? Do you remember the fact that the justified killings that you've seen in other movies, maybe they're still kind of justified because, in this American way, we kind of have this sense of justice that's kind of a little weird and twisted. But then when we see this weird and twisted version of American justice actually put before us, right? When Eastwood steps into this bar and there's all these dudes sitting around, and there's really only one guy who he has a problem with. The one guy who's the ringleader of it all. And great, you gun that guy down, cool. But he just mows down the entire bar. And it's like, I think I feel good, but this also feels awful. Like, this is terrible. So I feel like both of these movies both reach the same point, but on different sides of the coin. So Gordon?
Oh, I was going to say, having seen Unforgiven a second time, I think the similarity between these two movies is, especially with Unforgiven, what you said about the suffering. And when people get shot in Unforgiven, they don't just die right away. They sit there and they linger. I remember in one scene, he shoots the person who the bounty is there for, and he gut shoots him. He shoots him and he bleeds out slow. And he sits there and he begs for water. Clint Eastwood says, "Would you get him some water for Christ's sake?" Or when the Frisco kid, I can't remember his Cheyenne kid, I can't remember what his name was.
The young guy.
Yeah, the young guy who actually is blind and has to kill people for the first time. And how that last shootout happens in the bar. I think there's a lot of demythologizing of Western death, of how easy it is to kill someone. And if you want great dialogue, I mean, you just shot an unarmed man. And Clint Eastwood says, well, he should have armed himself. or little Bill sitting there on the ground saying, I don't deserve this. And Clint Eastwood said, deserves got nothing to do with it.
Yes. Oh, one of the best lines ever. Oh, my God.
I'll see you in hell, William Money. Okay.
And between two actors who, I mean, come on, these are two classic friggin' actors.
Oh, yeah. So and this is Eastwood playing the character he's been playing for several years. It's the killer, the man with no name. And he gives him a whole background and a hauntingness. And Gene Hackman's character would have been the hero in a different movie. He would have been Gary Cooper in a different movie. Here he's the villain. And just this whole idea of Richard Harris's character comes in and he's gonna mythologize the West. He's gonna write the story of the West, and Gene Hackman's like, no. This is what really happened.
Yeah.
This is what's really going on.
One thing that I really like, and which I think is important, is that Eastwood's character in Unforgiven is basically every other Western character ever, X number of years later.
Yeah.
Fast forward however many years you need to make it work. Like 5 years, 10 years, 20 years. But it's basically every Western character ever later. Because most Western characters, I mean, there's exceptions, of course. But most Western characters, like, they're killing people in the name of good. We think of this modern idea of like, well, I'm just protecting my property, so Second Amendment, I'm going to gun down people, and so it's all justified. No, it actually really isn't. Like, there should at least, I'm sorry, I'm getting into morals at this point, but like, morally there should be this idea of like, equality of force or whatever. But in Western ideals, it's, you're on my property, shoot to kill. That's sort of thing. So I like that Unforgiven brings that to its logical conclusion, right? Whereas, to bring it back to our topic, Once Upon a Time in the West is this is the myth. This is the fairy tale of what Westerns are. We've seen all the tropes. Leone knows them all too. He gets them. And he's like, okay, I know that you get them. I'm going to distill them all into a package that you understand and that makes sense. And that still comments on the progression of capitalism through the West and the way that so-called manifest destiny took over all these lands that weren't actually the lands of these so-called settlers and so on and so forth. It's all there, but he packages it into an amazing classic Western, and that's why I think Once Upon a Time in the West is the greatest Western ever made.
So, well, I was going to ask you, you just answered that. So let me just start with you, Eric, and then end it with Gordon. So I was going to ask you why you think it's a great film. You just aptly summed it up. Is there anything else? Is there anything else that you wanted to add that we haven't touched upon yet about this film?
No, I don't think so. I think I said more than enough. I would just say this. My Mount Rushmore of Westerns would of course be this and Unforgiven, and the rest is really, really sketchy because it's like there's Stagecoach, Pale Rider, Searchers.
Come on, man. Wild Bunch.
Wild Bunch is on there.
Okay.
Like the rest is tough. So we might have to do a whole nother hour on like what the Mount Rushmore of Westerns are. But I will say my two are this and Unforgiven. I mean, Wild Bunch. I mean, Gordon calls me out, right?
I would throw Red River, Johnny Guitar, and as far as recent, I'm one of the guys that defends recent westerns. I think the assassination of Jesse James is one of the best westerns that's ever been made in the last few years. And there's also these neo-westerns that are coming out, like No Country for Old Men and from Miguel Estrada, that are just kind of using little western tropes here and there, but aren't definitively westerns. And and the Australian movie, like, have you seen The Proposition? Oh my God, Proposition is really, really, really good. Australian Outback movie. So
Dan, thank you for having Gordon on here because I didn't know about some of this Australian shit.
Yeah.
Oh my God, I'm so glad.
Australian West, because they're not really Western, because Australia's not the West. But
so what are they called? Kangaroo Westerns?
Or
Wallaby Westerns?
I think the term is Ozploitation. Ozploitation. But The Proposition is a fantastic Western.
If you can, Proposition, is that what it is?
Yeah, it's called The Proposition.
Okay.
And if you look up Australian Westerns, you should get a few titles that are interesting. But there's a whole bunch.
So Gordon, if you can just give a sum up then of why someone who hasn't watched this before should watch it and why it's a great film.
First of all, it's entertaining as hell. So just on those practical reasons, it's an enormously entertaining movie. It's one of the few Westerns I think actually is mythical. It hits that beat of Western myth. You have beautiful, beautiful mise-en-scene. You have tight editing. And my God, that Metacon soundtrack, oh man, that is one of the best soundtracks you will ever hear. That, Once Upon a Time in America, this guy was a legend. Even if you haven't, you've heard his music, even if you aren't aware of his music. His soundtrack for the Mission is still more famous than that movie, I think. And I think it's just a beautifully realized document. And just as someone, there's battles going on about how we teach American history. And I think that Once Upon a Time in the West is an unsanitized version of American history. For all the John Wayne, Gary Cooper, foundational lawmen movies we get, it's very important that we have a movie like Once Upon a Time in the West that says there was a lot of murder, a lot of genocide to make America what it was. and America wasn't founded, it was stolen. And this, and I'll call it unromanticized. Unromanticized view of Western expansion, I think, is gritty, entertaining, and something that deserves to be seen.
Well, I want to thank both of you. I would add Shane to that list of Rushmore. I think one of the best speeches a villain ever gives is the guy who's talking about how he stole the land from the Indians and now they're trying to steal, the settlers are trying to steal it from him. And I think it's one of the few films that's actually basically told from a child's point of view. So you get the most pure idea of a hero there. But Gordon, I'll link to your URL for your university, and I'll link to Eric your website as well. So thank you both for talking about Once Upon a Time in the West.
Thank both of you guys.
Okay, Dan, if you need someone to talk about movies, you got my number.
Yeah, thanks. Take care.
You know what?
Bye.
Bye-bye.